The line began before the rooster crowed, a thin, shuffling queue of shadows in the gray pre-dawn. They were her neighbors, the same people who had watched her with pity or amusement for months. Now their faces were tight with a hunger that had burned away all pride. They clutched coins in their fists and empty baskets in their hands. At the head of the line, Ilara stood behind a simple plank table. Beside her were crates of eggs, their shells ranging in color from pale cream to deep chocolate to a soft, dusty blue. She was not smiling, but her face was calm, a small island of order in a sea of quiet desperation. Near the back of the line, his expensive hat pulled low as if to hide his face, was Silas Croft, the grain dealer. He, who had laughed the loudest, now stood waiting like all the rest, his wealth as useless as dust in a drought. He watched her, his eyes narrowed, not with amusement anymore, but with the bitter astonishment of a man who has miscalculated the entire world. Ilara met his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanging, before turning to the first woman in line. She took the woman's coins, counted out 6 eggs, no more, no less, and placed them gently in her basket. 6 was the rule. 6 was what a family could eat, and it was what left enough for the next family, and the one after that. It was the arithmetic of survival, and in this, she had become the town's unlikely teacher. 6 months earlier, the only line Ilara stood in was one of mockery. She had come to the town of Prairie Dust with little more than a deed to a patch of land her great-uncle had drunk himself to death on. It was 40 acres of baked clay and bitterweed that the sun had beaten into submission. The town watched her arrival, a woman alone, with the kind of speculative silence reserved for doomed ventures. They gave her a season, maybe 2, before she'd pack up or sell for pennies to Mr. Croft, who was always waiting to absorb such failures into his ever-expanding holdings. Her first public act was to attend the poultry auction, but not to buy the prize-winning pullets. She waited until the very end, when the commercial hatchery truck backed up to the loading dock. A man with a clipboard shouted, "240 spent hens for the renderer. $10 for the lot. Save me the fuel of hauling them to the pit." A wave of laughter went through the small crowd. Spent hens. Birds that had lived their entire lives in cages no bigger than their bodies, bred to lay an egg a day until their insides gave out. They were scrawny, mostly featherless, with pale combs and eyes that were vacant with a deep, exhausted terror. They were worthless, fit only for bone meal and fertilizer. Silas Croft, standing near the auctioneer, caught Ilara's eye. "There's a bargain for you, miss," he called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "A whole flock of soup bones. Barely have to pluck 'em." The laughter swelled. Ilara walked forward, her face betraying nothing. She looked at the crates packed with miserable, trembling creatures. She saw not soup bones, but a flicker of life that had been crushed but not yet extinguished. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn $10 bill. "I'll take them," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The auctioneer stared, then shrugged. "Sold to the lady with an appetite for misery." The men who helped her load the heavy crates onto her rickety wagon did so with broad, performative grunts, winking at each other. "Careful now," one said. "Don't want to bruise the meat." Ilara said nothing. She handed over the $10, her entire fortune for capital improvements, and clicked the reins of her old mule. As she pulled away, Croft's voice followed her. "You'll be buying feed from me by the end of the week, ma'am, and I'll tell you now, my prices are firm." She did not look back. She just drove her cart full of broken birds toward the patch of baked earth everyone knew was worthless. The laughter of the town echoing behind her like a prophecy she had no intention of fulfilling. The journey to her land was a slow, rattling affair. The hens, crammed into their crates, made no sound, their silence more unnerving than any squawking would have been. They were creatures who had forgotten the language of their own kind. When she finally reached her property, the sun was a hammer in the sky. She'd spent the previous weeks building a small, sturdy shed from scavenged lumber, but the real work was the fence. It was a clumsy, patched-together thing, enclosing a single acre of the worst land, but it was strong. One by one, she opened the crates. The hens did not pour out. They huddled in the far corners, trembling. She had to reach in and lift them out, their bodies shockingly light, their bones as fragile as twigs. She set them down on the earth, and they froze, petrified. They had never felt sun on their backs or dirt beneath their feet. They had never known a world wider than a wire cage. They stood motionless, a pathetic army of skeletons draped in skin and a few ragged feathers. Ilara left them, hauling buckets of water from her well, a deep, reliable well that was her uncle's only useful legacy. She set out shallow pans of it, along with a scattering of the cheap, cracked corn she'd been able to afford. The hens ignored it all. They just stood, blinking in the terrifying expanse of the open sky. By dusk, none had moved. She feared they would simply die of shock. As darkness fell, she gently herded them into the shed she had built, a low, warm space deeply bedded with straw. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, the arithmetic churning in her mind. $10 for the hens, a few dollars more for the corn. Her savings were a tiny, dwindling pile of coins in a jar. She had maybe a month before she would be destitute. A soft knock came at her door. It was her only neighbor, Mr. Anya, an old Hungarian man whose own small plot was a miracle of green, orderly rows carved out of the same unforgiving soil. He held a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "A welcome," he said, his voice a low rumble. He placed the bundle on her table. It was a loaf of dark, heavy bread. He looked past her, toward the silent shed. "The town, they laugh," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ilara said. He nodded slowly, his eyes kind. "They see only what is. You must see what can be." He walked to her doorway and pointed a gnarled finger at the packed, lifeless ground. "This land, it looks dead. The chickens, they look dead." He paused, then tapped his temple. "But the land does not know what a thing is called. It only knows what a thing does. They call your hens spent. The land does not care. The land asks, will they scratch? Will they eat the weed seeds? Will they turn the soil and leave their droppings?" He looked at her, his gaze intense. "That is all that matters, not the name, the doing." He told her then what they needed, not just corn. They needed grit for their gizzards, which they would find themselves if they learned to scratch. They needed greens for their health. He pointed to the bitterweed and thistle choking the edges of her property. "Most hens will not touch, but a hungry hen, a hen who remembers the wild parts of herself, she will learn. And they need bugs, protein. The grasshoppers will come. Let the chickens be your harvest crew." His advice was the opposite of everything the men at the auction believed. They saw chickens as machines for turning expensive grain into eggs. Mr. Anya saw them as partners in the slow, patient work of healing the land. Before he left, he looked at her again. "Be patient," he said. "They have to forget the cage. That is the hardest work of all." For a week, the hens did almost nothing. Ilara would open the shed door each morning, and they would remain huddled inside, a mass of trembling bodies. She would scatter corn and fresh water, and they would eat and drink only when she retreated to a great distance. They were terrified of her, of the sky, of the wind. She spent her days reinforcing her fence and clearing a small patch for a garden, using a pickaxe to break the hard-pan clay. Every evening, she would gently herd the unresponsive birds back into the shed. The town's laughter had faded to a knowing silence. They were just waiting for the inevitable. But Ilara remembered Mr. Anya's words. Be patient. On the 8th day, something changed. A large, iridescent grasshopper landed near a particularly scrawny hen, one Ilara had privately thought of as the most hopeless. The hen stared at it, her head cocked, a flicker of some ancient instinct stirring in her vacant eyes. Then, with a speed that was shocking, she lunged, her beak snapping the insect out of the air. She swallowed it in one gulp. And then she did something extraordinary. She took a hesitant step, lowered her head, and scratched at the dirt with her foot. It was a weak, clumsy gesture, but it was a start. Within the hour, another hen copied her, and then another. By the end of the day, a dozen of them were tentatively scratching, exploring the texture of the world beneath their feet. It was a turning point. A small, ragged boy named Finn started appearing at her fence line. He was one of the town's strays, a quiet 10-year-old with watchful eyes who was always on the periphery of things. He never spoke, just watched her work. One afternoon, he pointed to the hen who had eaten the grasshopper. "That one's the general," he said, his first words to her. Ilara paused, leaning on her shovel. "Why is she the general?" "She's the bravest," Finn said simply. From then on, he became a fixture. He helped her patch the fence and haul water, his silence slowly giving way to a steady stream of observations. He began naming the hens. There was Beatrice, who was always last out of the coop, a trio of identical birds he called the sisters, and a formidable fluffy hen named Mrs. Gable, after the town's most notoriously gossipy woman. The naming seemed to give them identities, transforming them from a wretched mass into a flock of individuals. Ilara, following Mr. Anya's advice, stopped buying so much corn. Instead, she spent her mornings foraging along the creek bed for clover and wild greens, which she chopped and mixed with what little grain she had. The hens, driven by hunger and their reawakening instincts, began to forage for themselves. They ate the bitterweed. They devoured thistle seeds. They spent their days in a slow-moving procession across their acre, scratching, digging, turning the hard soil. They were tilling and fertilizing her land for free. Their feathers began to grow back, not the uniform white of the hatchery, but a surprising mix of reds, browns, and speckled blacks. Their combs pinked up. Their eyes grew bright and alert. They were starting to look like actual chickens. Each night, Ilara did her arithmetic. The feed costs were down, but her savings were still draining away. The hens were getting healthier, but they weren't laying. The prophecy of the town still hung over her. She was running out of time. She needed a sign, some proof that this mad gamble was more than just a slow, laborious way to starve. One morning in late June, she went to the coop and saw it. Tucked into a corner of the straw, almost hidden, was a small, pale brown egg. It was misshapen, thin-shelled, and no bigger than a pigeon's egg, but it was unmistakably an egg. Ilara picked it up, her rough hand surprisingly gentle. She held it in her palm, feeling its impossible warmth. It was not just an egg, it was a promise. She carried it back to her small cabin and set it on the windowsill where the morning light could catch it. It was a treasure, a secret victory she shared with no one. The next day there were 2 more eggs, slightly larger and better formed. She found Finn by the fence, his eyes wide. He pointed toward the coop. "I saw Beatrice go in," he whispered, as if a great secret was being shared. "I think she did it." They collected the eggs together. Ilara gave one to Finn, who cradled it like it was made of gold. The rest she kept. By the end of the week, they were collecting over a dozen eggs a day. They were not the uniform, sterile white eggs from the general store. These were a palette of colors: cream, tan, deep chocolate, and even a few of a startling, beautiful blue-green. Their shells were thick and strong, their yolks a rich, fiery orange, the color of a flock that lived on bugs and sun and wild greens. She kept her success hidden, like a coal banked low under ash. She knew the town was not ready to see it. Pity could turn to envy in a heartbeat, and envy was a more dangerous beast. She and Finn ate eggs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She used a few to barter with Mr. Anya for vegetables from his garden, a silent, knowing exchange that needed no words. He simply nodded, his eyes twinkling, as he accepted the small basket. The small surplus she stored in a cool, dark corner of her root cellar. One hot afternoon, a new sound broke the prairie silence, the clatter of a fine carriage pulled by a sweating horse. The carriage had a broken axle and had limped its way to her gate, the nearest sign of life. The driver was a man in city clothes, his face a mask of frustrated importance. "Ma'am," he said, mopping his brow, "I am the chef for the governor's banquet at the Capitol Hotel. My wagon has failed me, and worse, my crate of eggs has been smashed to an omelet on the road. The store in that wretched town has nothing but pale, watery things. Is there any chance you have a few fresh eggs to sell?" It was the moment she had been waiting for, though she hadn't known it. Silently, Alara went to her cellar and returned with a basket of 24 eggs, their varied colors glowing in the afternoon sun. The chef stared. He picked one up, a lovely blue one, and felt its weight. He looked at Alara, his professional skepticism melting into awe. "Where did you get these?" "I have a flock," she said simply. He cracked one open on the edge of the basket, letting the contents drop into his cupped hand. The yolk stood high and firm, a perfect dome of deep orange and a thick, clear white. He had not seen an egg like that in 20 years. "Good heavens," he whispered. "This is not a chicken egg. This is a jewel." He bought every egg she had, paying a price that made her breath catch in her throat. And then he did something more. "I will be back," he said, his voice firm with purpose. "Every Tuesday, my man will come. I will buy all you can sell me. Do not sell them to anyone else." He paid her in silver dollars, heavy and real in her hand. That night, her arithmetic was different. It was no longer about survival. For the first time, it was about a future. The chef's man, as promised, arrived the following Tuesday in a sturdy buckboard, and every Tuesday after that. He would load up his crates of eggs and leave a small, heavy pouch of coins on Alara's table. The sight of the fine buckboard making a regular trip to the worthless patch of land at the edge of town did not go unnoticed. The whispers in prairie dust began to change their tune. Mockery gave way to a grudging curiosity, which soon curdled into suspicion. No one could understand what a fancy man from the capital would want from the strange woman with the flock of walking skeletons. Mrs. Gable, the town gossip, swore she was practicing some kind of witchcraft, charming the eggs right out of the ground. The men at the feed store speculated that she had found a hidden spring, or perhaps her uncle had buried money before he died. It was easier to believe in magic or buried treasure than to admit they had been wrong. Silas Croft watched the buckboard come and go with a narrowing gaze. He had seen the coins exchanged. He had seen the look on the driver's face, the look of a man handling a valuable commodity. His business sense, sharp and predatory, told him he had missed something vital. He began to ride out past her property, slowing his horse to watch her flock. The hens were no longer pathetic. They were robust, fully feathered birds, moving with a confident purpose across the land. The acre they occupied was no longer bare clay. Their constant scratching and fertilizing had encouraged a low, hardy carpet of native grasses and clover to take root. They had not just survived, they were transforming the very ground they walked on. Croft saw a resource he had foolishly, publicly written off, and he wanted it. His envy was a cold, hard knot in his gut. Meanwhile, Alara's small world continued to expand. With the money from the chef, she bought more fencing, enclosing another acre for the hens to forage. She bought a winter supply of grain, not from Croft, but from a farmer 2 towns over. She bought a new dress, a simple calico thing, but it was the first new piece of clothing she'd had in years. She and Finn built a second, larger coop, preparing for the future. The hens were now laying over 100 eggs a day. The work was constant, but it was satisfying. It was the rhythm of a life being built, egg by egg, day by day. One evening, Mr. Anya stopped by. He did not look at the healthy flock or the new fence. He looked at the sky. It was a brassy, cloudless dome, the sunset a fierce, angry red. "Too clear," he murmured, his face troubled. "The air is too still. The creek is low." He crumbled a bit of soil between his fingers. It was dry as powder. "The rain has forgotten us," he said. "When the land gets this thirsty, it gets mean." His words were a quiet prophecy, far more menacing than the town's earlier laughter. Alara felt a chill despite the evening heat. She looked at her flock, contentedly settling in for the night. They were her livelihood, her victory. But they were still fragile creatures, dependent on the water from her well and the life in her soil. The arithmetic in her head shifted once more. The equation was no longer just about profit and loss. It was now about the sky, the water, and the coming thirst. She began to prepare, not with fear, but with the same methodical patience she had applied to everything else. She and Finn dug trenches to channel any potential rainfall toward the garden. They reinforced the coops against the hot, dry winds, and every day she drew extra water, filling every barrel and bucket she owned, a quiet act of faith against a brazenly empty sky. The drought arrived not like a thief in the night, but like a guest who would not leave. August came in like the open door of a furnace. The sun was relentless, bleaching the color from the sky, the grass, the very world. The prairie grasses, which had been a sea of green, turned to brittle yellow straw. The farmers' corn crops, once their pride, withered on the stalk, the leaves rattling like dry bones in the hot wind. The town's creek slowed to a trickle, then vanished, leaving a cracked, muddy scar on the landscape. Dust coated everything, a fine, gritty powder that worked its way into homes, into lungs, into the spirit. The town of prairie dust grew quiet, the heat sucking the energy from its people. Tempers grew short, faces grew pinched and worried. The hens of the town, kept in small yards and fed on grain, stopped laying. The heat and the stress were too much. The eggs at the general store, shipped in from miles away, doubled in price, then disappeared entirely. But on Alara's 40 acres, a small miracle was unfolding. Her hens, the despised spent flock, were proving to be creatures forged in hardship. They were not delicate, overbred birds. They were survivors. While other animals wilted in the heat, they sought the shade beneath the new coops Alara and Finn had built. They spent the hottest parts of the day in dust baths, digging down to the cooler earth, a skill their caged ancestors had never known. Their diverse genetics made them resilient, and crucially, their diet was not dependent on the failed grain crops. They were expert foragers, and Alara's reclaimed pasture, though stressed, still offered up a bounty of insects, hardy weeds, and seeds that other birds would ignore. She supplemented their diet with the drought-resistant greens Mr. Anya had taught her to cultivate and with the precious water from her deep, unshakable well. They were still laying. Not as many as before, but a steady, reliable supply of 60 or 70 eggs a day. The chef's buckboard was now the only sign of commerce in or out of the town, a weekly reminder of the strange inversion of fortune that had occurred. Ilara had the only consistent source of fresh, high-protein food for 50 miles. Silas Croft's fortunes had reversed completely. His grain stores were dwindling, and the farmers who owed him money for seed now had no crops to sell, no way to pay their debts. He was land-rich and cash-poor, watching his empire of paper assets crumble to dust. The sight of Ilara's quiet success, of the capital buckboard, was a daily torment. He saw her not as a clever homesteader, but as someone who had gotten lucky, who possessed something she did not deserve. One afternoon, he rode out to her property, his face a mask of false cordiality. "Miss Ilara," he said, tipping his hat, "a terrible time for everyone." "It is," she agreed, her hands not pausing in her work of mending a trough. "I've been thinking," he said, getting to his point, "this operation you have here, it's impressive, but it must be a terrible burden for a woman alone, especially in this drought. You have to worry about water, feed, security." He gestured expansively. "I have resources. I can take this burden off your hands. I'll buy the entire flock. Name a price." Ilara stopped her work and looked at him, her eyes steady. She knew this was not an offer. It was the opening move in a siege. "They are not for sale, Mr. Croft." His smile tightened. "Don't be sentimental. They're just chickens. I'll give you a fair price, more than fair, enough to see you through this drought and then some." "They are my living," she said, "and they are not for sale." His cordiality vanished. "You are being foolish," he hissed. "You have no idea how to manage a real asset. I'm trying to help you. People get desperate in times like these. A lone woman with a valuable flock. It's a temptation. You need a man's protection." It was a threat, veiled in concern. "I am managing just fine," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a quiet coldness. "And I do not require your protection." She turned back to her work, a clear dismissal. Croft sat on his horse, his face flushing with rage. He had come expecting to intimidate a timid woman. He had found a will as hard as the baked earth beneath his horse's hooves. He rode off, but Ilara knew this was not the end of it. The arithmetic had changed again. The equation now included a new variable: the dangerous envy of a ruined man. The desperation Mr. Croft had spoken of began to manifest. The first to come were the children, their eyes large in their dusty faces, asking if she had any cracked eggs, any that were not fit to sell to the man from the city. Ilara gave them each a sound one, pressing it into their small hands. Then the mothers started to arrive, their pride a brittle shield against the hunger of their families. They offered to trade, mending for a half-dozen eggs, a jar of canned peaches from a better year for a dozen. Ilara accepted every offer. She set up a small table by her gate, a simple plank across 2 barrels. Each morning, after the chef's order was packed, she would place the remaining eggs there. Finn, who had become her steadfast partner, stood by her side, his quiet presence a comfort. One morning, a woman approached the table, her head held low. It was Mrs. Gable, the town's chief gossip, the one who had spread the stories of witchcraft. Her husband had lost his job at the mill, which had closed due to the drought. She looked at the eggs, then at Ilara, her eyes filled with a shame that was painful to witness. I have nothing to trade," she mumbled, her hands twisting in her apron. "But my children haven't had a proper meal in 3 days. I can pay you when the rains come." Ilara looked at the woman who had mocked her. She saw not an enemy, but a neighbor in need. This was the true test. The moment her success was weighed not in silver dollars, but in something far heavier. She could have turned her away. She could have savored the victory. Instead, she took a basket and filled it with a dozen eggs, more than she had given anyone else. "You will pay me back with a kindness to someone else when you are able," Alara said softly. "That will be payment enough." Mrs. Gable began to cry, silent tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. She took the basket and fled, unable to speak. The story of that exchange spread through the town faster than any gossip ever had. It was an act of grace that disarmed all the lingering envy and suspicion. From then on, the line at her gate was one of neighbors, not beggars. She set a fair price, a price anyone could afford. She continued to trade, and for those like Mrs. Gable, she gave credit, marking it down in a ledger not of debts, but of trust. She was feeding the town that had scorned her, and in doing so, she was binding it together. This, more than anything, enraged Silas Croft. He saw his own power, the power of debt and dependency, being replaced by a new economy, one built on Alara's generosity. He saw his authority as the town's provider slipping away to a woman with a flock of reject hens. He decided to act. He rode into town one afternoon with the constable, a man who owed him a great deal of money. They went directly to Alara's gate, where she was selling the last of the day's eggs. "Alara," Croft said, his voice loud for all to hear, "this charade is over. Several of my prize-winning hens went missing a few months back. It seems they've found their way into your flock." The crowd murmured, shocked. "These are my hens, Mr. Croft," Alara said, her voice steady. "I bought them at the auction." "You bought spent hens," he sneered. "These are clearly not spent hens. You must have supplemented them with stolen stock. I demand the return of my property. I estimate there are about 240 of them." He had meant to say 20 or 30, a plausible number. But in his anger, in his desperate need to claim her entire success as his own, the true number slipped out. The exact count of the hens she had bought for $10. A dead silence fell over the small crowd. The constable shuffled his feet, looking uneasy. Finn, who had been counting coins, looked up, his eyes wide. Alara's face remained a calm mask, but her mind was sharp as a needle. She looked directly at Croft. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the dusty yard with perfect clarity. "How did you know the count, Mr. Croft? I have never told a soul in this town how many hens I bought that day." Croft's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He had been caught in his own lie, exposed by his own greed. Everyone there understood. He couldn't have known the number unless he was the one who had mocked her for buying them, or unless he had been secretly watching, counting, coveting her flock for weeks. The constable looked from Croft's guilty face to Alara's still one and made a decision. He tipped his hat to Alara. "My apologies for the interruption, ma'am." He turned to Croft. "I think you and I need to have a talk about filing false claims, Silas." Shamed and exposed, Croft was led away, the eyes of the entire town following him, their judgment as silent and final as a closing door. The drought broke in the third week of September. It did not end with a gentle shower, but with a furious, cleansing storm that hammered the dust into mud and sent rivers of brown water down the town's main street. The sound of rain on her cabin roof was the sweetest music Alara had ever heard. The land, so long thirsty, drank and drank. Within a week, a faint, tentative green had begun to fuzz the brown landscape. The town began to heal. The mill reopened. The farmers, though they had lost a season, began to plan for the next. The line at Alara's egg stand shortened, but it never disappeared. It was no longer a line of desperation, but one of habit and loyalty. Her eggs were simply the best anyone had ever tasted, and buying them was a way of paying respect. Silas Croft was a broken man. His lie had cost him the one thing he truly valued, his reputation. His debtors found new, more lenient creditors. His customers went elsewhere. He eventually sold his holdings for a fraction of their worth and left town, a silent departure that no one mourned. Ilara's life settled into a new, prosperous rhythm. She bought the adjoining 40 acres, not for farming, but to ensure her flock always had wild land to forage on. Finn became her full-time partner, his sharp mind for numbers and his innate understanding of the animals making him indispensable. He was no longer a stray boy on the periphery. He had found his purpose. The chef from the capital continued his weekly purchases, and his praise of her eggs brought others. Merchants, hoteliers, and families who would drive a whole day for a taste of them. She became known not as the strange woman with the spent hens, but as the egg queen of prairie dust. Her little cabin became a proper farmhouse, her patched fence a sturdy, permanent boundary. The land that had been called worthless was now the most productive in the county, its soil growing dark and rich under the constant care of its feathered caretakers. She never expanded beyond what she and Finn could manage. She never bought fancy equipment. She understood that the magic was not in scale, but in the system itself, the partnership between the hens and the land. One cool evening, as the sun set in a blaze of peaceful color, Mr. Anya came to sit with her on her porch. They watched the flock, now over 300 strong, moving across the pasture in the fading light. The hens were a picture of health and contentment, their feathers gleaming, their clucking a soft, gentle music. They were beautiful, powerful creatures, and it was hard to remember the pathetic, broken things they had once been. "You have done a good thing here," Mr. Anya said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "A very good thing." Ilara smiled, a true, warm smile that reached her eyes. "You taught me how." He shook his head slowly. "No, I only told you a truth. You were the one who was brave enough to listen." He looked out at the flock, then back at the dark, fertile earth. "You see," he said, his voice a soft rumble, "the land did not care that they were called spent. It never does. It only cared that they would scratch for their living. It only ever cares about the doing." Ilara watched as General Tilly, the first to scratch, the first to remember she was a chicken, marshaled a small group to chase after a final, late-day grasshopper. The sight was no longer a miracle, but the simple, beautiful truth of her life. She had taken what the world had thrown away, and on a patch of land no one wanted, she had built not just a business, but a home, a community, and a future, all on the foundation of a $10 gamble and the patient, tireless work of doing. The seasons turned. The deep green of a wet spring followed the quiet white of winter. Ilara's flock grew, not through massive acquisitions, but by the slow, natural process of allowing her best hens to sit on clutches of their own colorful eggs. The chicks that hatched were a hardy, mottled bunch, with the foraging instincts of their mothers bred deep in their bones. They were true prairie chickens, perfectly suited to the land they were born on. Finn, now a young man of 15, had taken over the account books entirely. He had a natural gift for the arithmetic that Ilara had once plotted by candlelight. He negotiated with the buyers from the city, ensuring they always got a fair price, but never a gouging one. He managed the flock's rotation across the now lush 80 acres, moving their portable coops every few weeks to give the pasture time to recover and regrow. He was a master of the land's quiet rhythms, a skill no school could have taught him. The town of Prairie Dust had changed too. The memory of the great drought was a scar that had taught them a hard lesson about resilience. They no longer put all their faith in single cash crops or the pronouncements of men like Silas Croft. They diversified. More families kept kitchen gardens. They started a cooperative for sharing tools and labor. And at the center of this new web of community was Alara's farm. Her egg stand was now a small, proper farm store, where she also sold the excess vegetables from her garden and Mr. Anya's. Mrs. Gable, her debt of kindness long since repaid, worked in the store 3 days a week, her sharp tongue now used to praise the quality of the produce and share recipes with customers. People came not just to buy, but to talk, to trade news, to feel a part of something that worked. Ilara herself had become a quiet authority in the region. Other farmers, men who had once laughed at her, now came to her for advice. They would stand, hats in hand, and ask how she had managed to restore her soil, how she kept her flocks so healthy without expensive medicines. She never preached, she simply showed them. She would walk them through her pastures, pointing out the clover and the deep-rooted native grasses the hens' activity had encouraged. She would show them her system of composting the bedding from the coops, turning waste into black gold for her garden. She explained the simple, profound logic she had learned from Mr. Anya, that everything must serve more than one purpose. The hens were not just egg layers, they were tillers, fertilizers, and pest controllers. The garden was not just for food, its scraps fed the hens. It was a closed circle of thrift and abundance. One day, a government agent from the state agricultural department came to visit. He was a young man, fresh from college, full of charts and theories. He had heard stories of the woman who had turned a wasteland into a profitable farm with a flock of reject chickens. He came expecting to find a quaint, sentimental hobby. He left with a notebook full of observations and a dazed look on his face. "I don't understand it," he said to Finn as he was leaving. "According to our models, this soil shouldn't be this productive. Her input costs are a fraction of the commercial operations, yet her yield per animal is, well, it's remarkable." Finn just smiled. "The models don't account for the chickens," he said. "They just see them as a production unit. They don't see the doing." The agent looked back at the flock, spread out across the green hillside like a moving tapestry. For the first time, he seemed to see them not as livestock, but as an integral part of a living system. Alara never grew rich in the way Silas Croft had understood the word. She had no desire for vast holdings or power over others. Her wealth was in the deep, dark soil, the health of her animals, the loyalty of her community, and the peace she felt each evening as she watched the sun go down over a world she had helped heal. Her hands were permanently rough, her face lined by sun and wind, but her eyes were clear and content. She had proven that value is not always visible, that strength can be found in the things others discard, and that the most profound changes begin with a single, patient act of faith. The story of the $10 hens became a local legend, a tale told to children to teach them about perseverance and seeing the world with different eyes. It was a story about how a lone woman, with nothing but a patch of bad land and a cart full of broken birds, had managed to feed a town, build a future, and remind everyone of a simple, forgotten truth. The world does not care what a thing is called. It only cares about what it does.